The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind you get underground with machinery breathing through concrete and ventilation pushing recycled air past your face. I knew that silence. Site 41 always had a low electrical hum in its bones, a steady vibration in the walls that settled behind your teeth if you stayed down there long enough. There was always that metallic tang in the air too, as if the whole place had been built inside a bloodless mouth. But when the chamber door stood open, all of that dropped away. My ears tightened at once like I'd gone underwater too fast. The pressure built inward. The corridor lights looked normal. The red status panel beside the chamber looked normal. The lock display still read sealed. The door was open anyway. Inside, the chamber looked empty at first, and a clean circle of white floor and smooth walls. No furniture, no restraints, no object in the center, nothing visible at all. Then the speaker clicked, and a woman's voice came out so calm it made the skin on my arms tighten. "You made the same choice again." I knew that voice before my mind let me know that I knew it. I turned to the monitors above the observation glass. Every screen showed the chamber from a different angle. Every screen showed a man standing inside it. Me. Not a distorted reflection, not a lagging feed. I was standing in the corridor, one hand still on my tablet, and there I was on every monitor inside the chamber, head bent, speaking to something that wasn't there. Then the intercom above the door gave its soft confirmation tone and said in the site's neutral system voice, "Containment breach resolved. EU subject secured." I was still outside, so who exactly had the system just locked in there? It started 4 days earlier with a transfer order and a room that felt deeper than the desert above it. By the time Site 41 requested me, I'd spent most of my adult life building rules for places no one sane would choose to work. Not cages, not really. Frameworks, behavioral structures, decision trees that turned fear into procedure and procedure into survival. That was what people said about me anyway. They said I could look at an anomalous environment and strip it down to its useful parts. They said I understood that containment wasn't about courage, it was about consistency. They also said I never let sentiment into a protocol review. That last part was true. The transfer order came through at dawn, encrypted, high priority, even with Vaughn Ellery's name attached to it. Site Director, Site 41, Clark County, Nevada. I knew Ellery by reputation. He was one of those men who lasted a long time in foundation work by sounding tired before anyone else had the chance to become dramatic. His attached note was short. Need expert assessment on contained communicative anomaly. Existing rules effective. Compliance deterioration among local personnel. Request outside review. I accepted within the hour. The drive from the airstrip took me past flat stretches of heat-cooked earth and abandoned federal signage half buried in dust. The facility above ground was a dead shell, a decommissioned administrative complex with sun-bleached walls and windows dark from the inside. The real site sat below it, reached by 2 badge checkpoints, 1 freight elevator, and a final descent in a caged lift that rattled just enough to remind you how much stone hung over your head. The air changed halfway down. Dry desert gave way to recycled cold, metal, ozone, something almost medicinal. I always liked that smell. It meant systems were in place. A security officer walked me through intake, then handed me to Ellery outside the central control room. He was taller than I expected, narrow-shouldered, silver at the temples, with the drained expression of a man who'd spent too many nights under fluorescent lights and no longer considered sleep part of his job description. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Dr. Mercer," he said, offering a hand that felt cold and dry. "Appreciate the quick turnaround. I was told you had a communication issue." He gave the smallest shrug. "That's one word for it." He took me down a corridor where the hum of the generators lived inside the walls. I could feel it through the soles of my shoes. My ears popped once, then settled into that familiar underwater pressure that certain field systems produced when they were tuned too high. Observation windows lined one side of the hall, black from this angle. Containment doors lined the other, each marked with hazard colors and access codes. Everything smelled sterile. Everything was clean enough to make a person trust it. Your brief said the anomaly was non-hostile, I said. That designation hasn't changed. But staff compliance has. That's why you're here. He led me into a briefing room with a single terminal already active. My personnel file sat on one side of the screen. The containment overview sat on the other. I noticed that before he invited me to sit. I don't think I understood then why that detail bothered me. The anomaly had no listed mass, no stable visual profile, and no confirmed biological markers. It occupied a purpose-built chamber on the lowest active level of the site. It had never physically breached. It had never directly injured personnel. It had, however, demonstrated what the report called cognitively invasive communication patterns. Staff exposed to it for prolonged periods developed interpretive fixation, procedural hesitation, and in 2 recorded cases, active non-compliance with containment rules. So they gave me the current rules. There were 5 of them, issued as a formal briefing addendum, plain text, no elaboration. I read the first line aloud because that was how I checked cadence in a protocol. You do not enter the containment chamber under any circumstances. Ellery watched me, expression flat. I read the second. If the entity speaks, do not respond verbally. The third. All observations must be recorded, not interpreted. The fourth. Do not acknowledge any voice that uses personal identifiers. And the fifth. If you see yourself inside the chamber, initiate lockdown immediately. The room was cold enough that I could feel the dryness at the back of my throat. I read the 5th line again, then looked up. That's an outlier. It was added after the 2nd event. What event? The kind you're here to prevent from happening a 3rd time. He said it without emphasis. That was what made it worse. I asked for the original acquisition report. He gave me the restricted version. And the anomaly had been found during the renovation of a federal archival wing beneath the older facility, in a room that predated every modern blueprint of the site. No religious markings, no symbols, no artifact. Just a chamber with strange acoustic properties and a set of interactions that intensified once containment equipment had been installed around it. The Foundation did what the Foundation always did. It sealed the room, instrumented the perimeter, and named the problem after the shape it made in a database. What does it want? I asked. Ellery folded his hands. Conversation? That's all? So far. I almost smiled at that. Almost. Then your issue isn't containment, I said. It's personnel discipline. Ellery's eyes rested on me for a second too long. That was my assumption too. Looking back, and that was the first moment I should have paid attention to his wording instead of my own confidence. He took me to the observation level after the briefing. The corridor narrowed there, the walls thicker, the lights dimmer around the edges to reduce reflection on the glass. I heard the field generators before I saw the chamber, a low unbroken current that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of the building. The recycled air carried that same metallic tang. My ears tightened again. The chamber itself was disappointingly simple. A circular room behind reinforced glass. White floor, white walls, seamless surfaces. No shadow deep enough to hide a person in. No visible source of the voice described in the reports. Nothing hung from the ceiling. Nothing moved in the center. It was empty. Professionally, I found that reassuring. Personally, I found it offensive. Too many people in our line of work mistook absence for depth. They saw an empty room and filled it with mythology. Most anomalies became easier to manage when you removed the stories frightened people built around them. Ellery wanted an outside review because his staff had started telling themselves there was intelligence in that chamber. Intention, design, meaning. I saw an enclosed space, a set of communication triggers, and a staff culture that had gotten too close to its own subject. "I'll begin live observation after shift turnover," I said. Ellery nodded. "You've got full review authority. Dr. Mercer?" I glanced at him. He didn't continue. For a second, I thought he'd forgotten what he meant to say. Then he added, "If it uses your name, don't answer." I gave him a thin look. I did read the briefing. I know. That was the last normal conversation I had in that place. At 1900 hours, I took the observation room alone. The chair was bolted to the floor. The tablet interface was old but functional. Audio feeds from the chamber could be isolated, filtered, or cut entirely. The glass was thick enough to muffle the room beyond even without the field, though there was nothing in the room to muffle. A stainless steel vent breathed cool air over my hands. The hum in the walls settled into a constant presence, almost soothing, like an engine at idle. I started a formal observation log and began with environmental notes. Sterile recycled air, faint metallic odor. Baseline generator resonance stable. Mild pressure in ears consistent with active field. Chamber visually empty. No motion detected. And then I looked up at the chamber itself and waited for something to prove Site-41 deserved the attention it had demanded from me. For the first 11 minutes, nothing happened. On the 12th, the speaker clicked. The sound was tiny, just plastic and current. But in that room, with the hum under everything and the dry cold pressing against my face, it felt as intimate as someone leaning close enough to breathe on my cheek. "Dr. Mercer," a voice said gently, "how long do you usually wait before you decide a door should stay closed?" I didn't answer. The voice was human, adult and sexless in the way poor recordings sometimes were. Calm, almost courteous. It didn't sound strained or hungry or triumphant. It sounded as if it had been waiting for me specifically and was relieved to have reached the correct line. I marked the timestamp and recorded exactly what had been said. That was all. The rule wasn't difficult. Not yet. The speaker remained quiet for almost a minute. I could hear only the hum of the field and the faint hiss of ventilation above the glass. Somewhere in the control corridor beyond the sealed door, a cartwheel squeaked once and passed out of range. Then the voice returned. "If I asked the question differently," it said, "would that make it easier for you to hear?" The skin between my shoulder blades tightened. The pressure in my ears seemed to deepen, not painfully, but enough to remind me there was machinery all around that room shaping the air into conditions someone else had chosen. I wrote the line down. I kept my breathing even. I didn't respond. "All right," the voice said after another pause. "Churon, you can write." I didn't like the way it said that. Not because it was threatening. It wasn't. Not because it sounded familiar. It didn't. Not yet. I didn't like it because there was a softness to it I associated with private understanding, the tone people used when they believed they knew something about you that you hadn't offered them. I adjusted the audio gain by 1 increment and continued logging. The voice spoke 3 more times during that first session. It asked whether I preferred observation rooms to laboratories. It asked whether I trusted sealed systems because they protected people or because they kept people from changing their minds. Then, near the end of the hour, it asked the one question that stayed with me after I shut the feed down. "Do you think silence keeps a choice from belonging to you?" It was a well-constructed prompt. That's how I thought of it then. Not an accusation. Not even a challenge. A prompt shaped to produce discomfort in someone inclined toward certainty. I still didn't answer. When the session ended, the room felt colder than it had an hour earlier. My fingertips had gone numb from resting against the tablet casing. The metallic edge in the air seemed stronger. I exported the log, scrubbed the audio twice, and flagged the exchange as a probable adaptive communication pattern designed to induce personal engagement. A clean assessment, useful, detached. Then I sat there another 30 seconds listening to the empty hum on the line after the speaker had gone quiet, and noticed that I was waiting to hear it speak again, and I told myself that was professional curiosity. At the end of the shift, Ellery met me outside the observation room with 2 cups of machine coffee, both burnt enough to smell like wet cardboard. He handed me one without asking if I wanted it. "Well," he said, "it's conversational, targeted, likely pulling from personnel files." He took a sip. "You think it has access?" "I think your staff does. Information leaks. Tone gets mythologized. People hear a voice that knows their name, they do half the work for it." Ellery looked through the dark glass into the chamber. "And if it doesn't? Then we tighten access and keep to the rules." He nodded once, but there was no relief in it. "That's what everyone says after the first shift." The coffee left a bitter film on my tongue. "Do you know meaning?" "Meaning it gets more specific." I almost asked him to elaborate. Almost. Instead, I said, "Put me back in tomorrow." He agreed immediately, which should have told me something too. That night in my assigned quarters, the air smelled faintly of dust baked into old vents. I reviewed the audio again through headphones, volume low, lights off, the way I often worked when I needed to isolate rhythm from content. The voice remained calm, measured, patient. It never raised its volume. It never distorted. It never asked for release. It never said it was trapped. It never even said what it was. Just before I shut the file, I heard a detail I'd missed the first time. Right before the line, "You can write," there was a tiny intake of breath. Not synthetic, not mechanical, human. I know now what that detail meant. I didn't then. And the second observation began the same way. Same dry cold, same metallic tang in the recycled air, same generator hum pulsing through the walls like a distant engine. The underwater pressure in my ears came on stronger this time, enough that I had to swallow twice before it settled. The chamber beyond the glass remained empty. I had reviewed prior site logs before coming down. Most were useless. Staff wrote too much or too little. They interpreted when told not to. They omitted the moments that embarrassed them and expanded the ones that made the anomaly sound clever. But one pattern did stand out. The entity adapted not only to the observer, but to the observer's relationship with record-keeping. Personnel who relied heavily on transcript review got earlier references to future statements. Personnel with direct action training got procedural prompts. It wasn't random, it wasn't theatrical, it felt curated. That irritated me enough to make me sharper. I started the session at precisely the same time as the day before and opened a split screen with live transcript on one side and manual notes on the other. If the anomaly was learning my rhythms, I wanted a cleaner comparison. I wanted to see exactly when it deviated from the pattern. The first deviation happened before the speaker clicked on. A line appeared in the automated event log at the edge of my screen. Observer remained silent. No audio event had occurred yet. I checked the timestamp. Current. Live. Then the speaker clicked and the voice said, "Nolan." Not Dr. Mercer. Nolan. The use of my first name should have made the violation easy to categorize. Rule 4 existed for a reason. Do not acknowledge any voice that uses personal identifiers. Straightforward. Useful. I should have marked it and moved on. Instead, I stared at the live log where the line observer remained silent had already been recorded, and felt an unpleasant prickle move across the back of my neck. The voice spoke again, still gentle. "I wanted to know if you still count before you decide." I kept my hands flat on the desk. I wrote down the exact wording. No interpretation. The log updated in the next panel. Observer notes wording. Increased pulse. I hadn't entered that. No biometric sensor was attached to me. I checked the system source path, and for a moment the logic part of my mind found relief. The room chairs included passive monitoring in the armature, the old health and stress telemetry tied into the site's standard wellness tracking. That explained the pulse line. Not the timing, but timing errors happened in legacy systems. Buffer lag, predictive assist, cached text rendered early. Technical explanations existed. They just didn't feel sufficient. "Nolan," the voice said more quietly, "did you listen to the whole call?" The room seemed to contract. I don't mean visually. The walls didn't move, the ceiling didn't lower. But the pressure in my ears deepened and the hum from the generators took on a denser texture, as though the sound itself had become particulate and was filling the space between my skin and my clothes. The recycled air smelled sharper, metallic, clean, like instruments laid out under bright light. I wrote nothing for 3 full seconds, and that was the first real mistake I made. Because once I hesitated, the memory arrived whole enough to affect my hands. A comm line crackling with alarm noise, a junior researcher struggling to keep her breathing even, a sealed chamber door, my own voice giving measured instructions because measured voices kept other people functional. Report pressure change, report visible contamination. Step back from the seam, wait for the cycle. I blinked hard and looked back at the empty chamber. No one stood there. Nothing moved. On the speaker, the voice breathed in again. This time, when it spoke, it was hers. Not approximately, not a voice borrowing tone from archived files, not the vague resemblance people invent when they're frightened and need patterns. It was Elise Harrow exactly, down to the slight dryness in the last consonants, and the clipped way she used my name when she was trying not to sound afraid in front of senior staff. "Nolan," she said, and I felt my fingers go cold on the tablet. The outer latches sticking. For a second, I could smell hot insulation and overheated plastic instead of sterile, filtered air. For a second, I heard the old alarm under the generators at Site 41, heard it so clearly I turned my head toward a sound that wasn't present. Then the hum in the walls brought me back. I didn't answer. I couldn't have if I'd wanted to. The log updated on its own. Observer remains compliant. Under it, a second line appeared. Observer reaches for left cuff in 4 seconds. I stared at it. I didn't move. Then, because reading it made the skin on my wrist crawl, I reached for my left cuff and tugged it down. 4 seconds almost exactly. In every part of me went still after that. I reviewed the system panel for spoofing. I checked the input source. I checked whether some technician on the local network was feeding the room a tailored harassment script. But the access trail was clean, closed, internal. And while I was checking it, Elise's voice continued speaking from the empty chamber as if we were halfway through a conversation I'd left unfinished years ago. "You told me to keep reporting conditions." I kept my eyes on the diagnostics and recorded the line by touch. "You said if I stayed calm, you could work the problem." My mouth had gone dry enough that swallowing hurt. "Nolan, I did stay calm." That was the point when fear should have become the dominant emotion. It wasn't. What I felt was something worse for a person like me. I felt recognition, not of the voice, and I recognized that immediately. What unsettled me was the shape of the exchange, the precision, the patience, the way it wasn't trying to overwhelm me with the memory, only place it between us and wait for me to arrange myself around it. Like a person who already knew where the fracture line was. I should explain something here because otherwise what happened next might sound impossible in the wrong way. In Foundation work, the impossible rarely arrives as spectacle. It arrives as a small procedural inconsistency you can't stop looking at. A timestamp out of order, a door that logs shut while standing open, an audio file that contains your own breathing before you put the headset on. If you survive long enough, that's what teaches you fear. Not monsters, not teeth, administration. I checked the live log again. A new line had appeared before the speaker emitted any sound. Observer continues silence. Observer experiences recall response. Then Elise said very softly, "Was it easier after you stopped calling me by name?" I stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. The sound was brief and ugly in the tight room. The chamber beyond the glass stayed empty.
Can you hear
My
me
pulse
now?
was loud enough that I could hear blood in my ears under the generator hum.
Harrow,
I should have ended the session then.
in.
I should have reported a targeted identity breach and pushed for a broader systems audit before re-engagement. Instead, I stayed. That decision matters, more than some of the larger ones. Because staying there, with my hands cold and my breathing finally betraying me, was the first time I wasn't acting out of protocol or duty or institutional expectation. I stayed because I needed to know what else it knew. Elise's voice did not fill the silence after my chair scraped. It let me have it. When the speaker clicked again, the line was almost conversational. "I know why you did it." I closed my eyes for one beat. Opened them again. No response. No interpretation, just record. The speaker clicked once more.
The
"I don't know
feeling
why
is
you still think the door was the important part."
voice.
At the end of the session, the system marked my behavior compliant and recommended continued observation. That was when I started to suspect the entity wasn't the only thing in the room with me. I didn't go to Ellery immediately. Instead, I requested the sealed archive on the Harrow event and sat alone in a records office that smelled like paper dust and coolant, listening to the ventilation tick behind the wall while the file decrypted. I told myself I needed context. I told myself I needed to know what pieces of the incident were available in sight and which had been imported from centralized review. Those were good reasons. They just weren't the real one. The archive was redacted in the usual way, clean black bars, clipped summaries, approved language. Containment override authorized by Dr. Nolan Mercer. Junior researcher Elise Harrow isolated in compromised test chamber during unstable spread event. Facility preservation prioritized. Casualty designation necessary loss. Necessary loss. There are phrases that do more damage by being tidy. I didn't remember when I'd stopped thinking of that record as a choice and started thinking of it as a solved problem. Maybe the file had done it for me. Maybe I'd done it myself the first time I repeated the language to a review board and found that no one challenged it, as long as the facility remained standing in the last paragraph. On the audio file attached to the report, my own voice sounded younger and steadier than I felt. Elise's did not sound panicked at first, just strained, focused, trying to be useful. I turned it off before the end. When I finally reported to Ellery, I gave him less than I knew and more than I should have. "It used a deceased researcher's voice," I said. He didn't react with surprise, only fatigue. I assumed it might. Why wasn't that in the brief? Because people start listening for ghosts instead of patterns. I studied him across the desk. The office air was stale, warm from electronics, and carrying that same faint metal note that seemed to live in the whole site. Did it use her voice with anyone else? No. That answer hit harder than the voice had, because if it only used Elise with me, then this was not broad cognition fishing around for leverage. It was directed, specific. Personal in a way the existing rules had not warned for, because the rules had been written as if this kind of intimacy were incidental. It wasn't incidental. It was the whole mechanism. Ellery folded his hands over a stack of unsigned forms. "Do you want to step back from the review?" "No." The speed of my answer seemed to interest him. "All right," he said. "Then tomorrow we add live video cross-monitoring." I should have asked why that hadn't been standard already. I should have asked who had written the current rules and under what conditions. And why the site director of an active containment facility sounded less concerned about the voice than about my reaction to it. Instead, I went back to quarters, lay awake, listening to the pipes knock somewhere in the walls, and noticed that every time I started to drift, I heard Elise say the same sentence in exactly the same tone. "I know why you did it." She never said I was wrong. That mattered more than if she had. The next day, they activated the full multi-angle monitor bank in the observation room. 6 screens over the glass, 3 independent camera lines, live time code, mirrored backup feed. Enough redundancy to settle the question of hallucination quickly if one existed. Enough instrumentation to reassure a person who still believed that more data naturally led toward truth. The room felt colder with the extra equipment running. A cooler air washed over the backs of my hands from the vent at desk level. The metallic tang was stronger than before, not overwhelming, just present. The generator hum carried a second note now, a higher vibration that sat behind my eyes. My ears pressed tight, then tighter. I began the session. For 17 minutes, nothing happened. Then one of the side monitors flickered. Not enough to call it a fault. Just a quick ripple at the edge of the frame, the kind you get when a live feed renegotiates signal priority. I marked it, kept watching. The chamber remained empty in front of me. On the top right monitor, I was standing inside it. I knew immediately what I was looking at because there is a kind of recognition that happens below thought. A body knows its own posture, the angle of a shoulder, and the habitual way weight settles more heavily to one leg after years of pacing hard floors. On the screen, the man in the chamber stood with his head slightly lowered and one hand braced against the inside of his forearm. The exact position I'd taken while listening to Elise's last transmission. My skin went cold so fast it felt wet. I looked through the observation glass at the actual chamber. Empty white floor, seamless curved wall. Nothing. I looked back to the monitor. Still there. The image wasn't distorted. It wasn't ghosted over the chamber feed. It was clean, correctly lit, perspective accurate. My own face turned partly away from camera as if I were listening to someone standing just out of frame. The time code matched the room around me. Live. Rule 5 came back to me in Ellery's dry briefing voice. If you see yourself inside the chamber, initiate lockdown immediately. My hand moved toward the control panel, then stopped above it. Because on the middle screen, the man inside the chamber lifted his head and spoke. My audio line remained silent for half a second after his mouth moved. Then the chamber speaker clicked, and I heard my own voice say, "I understand." I had not spoken. The room around me seemed to tilt, not physically, but in the way orientation breaks when 2 reliable inputs refuse to agree. The hum in the walls deepened. My ears hurt. The recycled air suddenly felt too thin. I hit the audio isolate and rewound 6 seconds. Live feed locked. Playback denied. A system message rose on the panel. Concurrent active subjects. I read it twice before it made any sense. Then I checked the status ledger tied to observation access. Observer Dr. Nolan Mercer, active. Contained subject Dr. Nolan Mercer, active. There are moments when language fails because it's too effective. A single line of text can arrive in the mind fully formed and still not become believable. That was one of those moments. I stared at my own name occupying 2 mutually exclusive roles in the same system and felt something old and carefully packed inside me begin to shift. The monitor version of me turned slightly toward the far side of the chamber, toward empty space, and nodded as though receiving instructions. I initiated lockdown. The room answered with a descending alarm tone and the hard mechanical thunk of blast seals sliding somewhere in the surrounding corridor. The observation glass polarized a shade darker for half a second, then returned to normal, and the chamber in front of me remained empty. On the monitor, I was still inside. The speaker clicked again. Elise's voice came through low and close, as if she were standing just behind my right shoulder. "You always do this part quickly." I turned so fast the chair hit the desk. No one stood behind me. The door to the observation room was sealed. The ventilation breathed cool air against the side of my face. The metallic smell felt stronger now, almost wet. I forced myself back to the screens. The man inside the chamber was still there. Still me. Still listening. Then the system added a new line beneath both status entries: lockdown accepted, compliant behavior recorded. The clean efficiency of that phrase hit me harder than the image had. Because if the rule existed to protect staff from contamination, then seeing myself in the chamber should have triggered alarm, quarantine, escalation, intervention. Instead, the system sounded satisfied. My response had been anticipated, rewarded almost, marked not as emergency action but as successful participation. I heard the outer door cycle behind me and Ellery entered at a controlled pace, not hurried, which meant the system had alerted him before the lockdown tone sounded in my room. "You saw it," he said. Not a question. I nodded once, unwilling to trust my voice, even though the rule only forbade responding to the entity, not to him. He looked at the monitor bank, then at the live status lines. His expression didn't change. "Did it speak?" "Yes." "Did you answer?" "No." That was true, though it no longer felt complete. Ellery stepped closer to the panel. He smelled faintly of stale coffee and the soap dispensers used in the medical wing, sharp and unscented. "Then you're still inside the envelope." "What envelope?" "The one the rules create." The phrasing was wrong. I heard it the moment he said it. "The rules are containment directives," I said. "They're filters." "For what?" His eyes stayed on the chamber. "For what you're capable of hearing." I stared at him. Then the speaker clicked, and my own voice from inside the chamber said, "He's not asking the right question." Ellery shut the audio feed without looking at the controls. That was when I understood something I hadn't wanted to understand. He wasn't afraid of the voice getting into my head. He was afraid of me listening long enough to realize he already knew what it was saying. Later, when I reviewed the incident log, the system record for that session omitted the audio entirely. It listed a visual duplication event, compliant lockdown response, and observer stress within acceptable parameters. Nothing about my voice on the monitors, nothing about concurrent active subjects, nothing about Ellery's envelope. The site wasn't just containing the chamber, it was curating the story of the chamber. Iris Caldwell came into it the following morning with the smell of citrus hand soap and printer toner on her sleeves. She couldn't have been more than 26. Young by foundation standards, though age in our world doesn't always line up with innocence. She wore the gray site jumpsuit half a size too big, badge-clipped crooked dark hair tied back in a way that had already started to come loose by the time she reached the observation level. She carried a stack of transcript binders against her chest and nearly dropped them when she saw me exiting the archive room. "Dr. Mercer, sorry," she said, shifting her grip. "Director Ellery said these needed your annotations before central review." Her voice was clear, unguarded, and not yet shaped into the flattened caution most site personnel developed after enough underground months. She looked at people directly when she spoke. That was the first thing. The second was smaller. She held the binders with her right thumb braced along the spine, the way Elise used to hold field manuals when she wanted both hands ready to turn pages quickly. The similarity was slight, probably meaningless. It hit me anyway. I took the binders without comment and glanced at the top label. Observation summaries redacted for transfer. A junior administrator could have handled it. Sending her personally was either carelessness or design. "You're new to observation?" I asked. 3 weeks on this level. Before that, I was in mimetic screening. She gave a quick smile that faded when I didn't return it. Mostly data hygiene, audio separation, language patterns, that kind of thing. And now transcript delivery. She adjusted the strap of an overfull satchel. Now whatever they need. That answer should have made her blend into the site. People down there did whatever they were needed for. But she said it without resignation, more like surprise that the work kept changing shape around her. I asked for her security classification. She gave it. It was lower than it should have been for anyone handling active observation material. "Who authorized your access?" "Director Ellery." Of course he did. I should have sent her away from the chamber level then. Instead, I brought her into the observation room on the pretense of needing a second set of eyes on transcript variants. That was the official reason. The truth was less flattering. I wanted to know whether the entity would use Elise with someone else in the room. I wanted to know whether the intimacy of its communication belonged to the anomaly or to me. The room felt warmer with another person in it, though the air remained cold. Her soap cut through the metal smell for a while. The hum in the walls seemed less absolute. Iris set down the binders, looked through the glass at the empty chamber, and frowned. "That's it?" "That's the chamber." "No, I mean the anomaly. That's the point. No stable visual profile." She pressed 2 fingers lightly against one ear, wincing. "Feels like diving. Field pressure. Does it always do that?" "At current strength." She nodded as if filing it away for later rather than accepting it as unpleasant fact. Then she sat, flipped open a binder, and began comparing my handwritten notes to the approved digital transcript. Her mouth tightened after less than a minute. "These aren't right." I looked over. "Explain." She tapped one line. "Your note says the voice asked whether silence keeps a choice from belonging to you. The approved transcript says the entity attempted moral framing. That's not a transcript. That's editorial." "Yes." She looked up. "That's normal here?" I didn't answer immediately. The hum under the floor seemed louder. Through the glass, the chamber remained empty. "What exactly is your role on this assignment, Caldwell?" She hesitated just long enough to be honest. "I think I'm supposed to make sure records match what the system expects." Not what happened, what the system expects. Something in my chest tightened at the clarity of that. We started the live session with both of us present. I gave her the rules verbally. She listened, though I could tell from her face that she disliked them before the speaker ever clicked on. Some people reacted that way to badly proportioned restrictions. They could feel when a rule had been written around an outcome rather than a risk. "Do not enter the chamber," I said. "If it speaks, do not respond verbally. Record only what occurs, not what you think it means. If it uses your name or anything personally identifying, do not acknowledge it. And if you see yourself inside the chamber, initiate lockdown." She stared through the glass as I spoke. "Has that happened to you?" "Yes." "And you stayed on the assignment?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "That's either very disciplined or very stupid. Those aren't mutually exclusive." For the first time, she smiled properly. The speaker clicked almost at once. I felt it before I heard it, a subtle tightening in the room, a slight change in pressure. The recycled air tasted metallic on the back of my tongue. Iris leaned forward. The voice that came through was not Elise's. It was clear, human, and difficult to place an age, neither male nor female at first pass. It sounded less like a person performing calm than a person who had never needed to raise their voice in order to be heard. "You're not the one the rules are for. it said. Iris blinked, then looked at me. I shook my head once, no response. She mouthed understood and picked up her pen. The voice continued, "But you knew that already." Still she didn't speak. Good. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She glanced at the transcript monitor, frowned, and muttered under her breath, not to the chamber, but to herself. "No, I didn't." The speaker answered her immediately. "I know." I turned toward her so sharply my shoulder hit the equipment rack. "What did I just say?" I asked. Her eyes widened. "I wasn't talking to it. It doesn't matter." Nothing happened. As if to underscore the point, the chamber remained empty. No alarm, no distortion, no shift in the lighting. Just the hum, the pressure in our ears, and the dry, filtered air brushing cold over our hands. Then the voice said, in with the same impossible calm, "You chose correctly." Iris looked at me again. "What does that mean?" I didn't know, but the phrase landed hard enough that I had to look away from her face, because I had heard its shape before, if not its exact wording. In performance reviews, in after-action summaries, in those sterile little approvals institutions hand out when they need to make your worst decision sound structurally sound. You chose correctly. Iris, not understanding any of that, leaned toward the glass. "What am I supposed to be choosing?" The speaker stayed silent. I should have ended the session. Protocol had already been breached. Instead, I found myself watching her the way I had once watched junior staff in training rooms, waiting to see whether curiosity would harden into panic or precision. Iris showed neither, and she showed attention. After a moment, she said more carefully, "Are you trying to get out?" I started to tell her to stop. Before I could, the voice replied, "No." She swallowed. "Then what do you want?" A breath on the line. Human. Close. "I want him to stop mistaking the system for his conscience." The hum in the walls seemed to dip, then return. Just enough for both of us to feel it. Iris's eyes moved slowly toward me. I shut the session down. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after the speaker cut off. The room felt colder than before. My hands were shaking very slightly, not visibly unless you knew what to look for. Iris did know. I could tell. She said quietly, "That's not how a hostile thing talks." "No." "Then why are the rules built like this?" I looked through the glass into the empty chamber and said the only honest thing I had. "I think that's the wrong question." She waited. But I couldn't tell her the right one yet because saying it aloud would have forced a shape onto a thought I was still trying to keep diffuse. The system flagged the session for non-compliance before we left the room. Not me. Iris. Her badge access dropped one tier by the time we reached the corridor. I spent most of that night in records. There is a particular smell to active archive rooms. Dry paper, old adhesive, coolant from the local server cabinets, and underneath it the stale tang of recycled air that has passed through too many people too many times. Site 41's archive wing had all of that, plus the faint metallic edge that seemed strongest near anything tied to the chamber. I sat under dim overhead strips with Iris's annotated transcript on one side of the terminal and the official session export on the other. They did not match. Not in tone, not in wording, not even in sequence. Every answer the entity had given Iris beyond the first line had been flattened into procedural abstractions. Not quotes, not summaries, replacement language. Instead of, "I want him to stop mistaking the system for his conscience," the official record read communicative subject attempted rapport destabilization. Instead of, "You're not the one the rules are for," it read non-compliant observer exposed to adaptive address. It wasn't redaction. It was translation, and not toward clarity, toward management. I checked older logs with that in mind and found the same pattern everywhere. Moments of personal specificity converted into generalized threat terminology. Direct questions reframed as manipulative probes. The more intimate the exchange, the more aggressively the system stripped it down into something administratively legible. Then I found the deeper problem. In 3 separate logs, including one from my own earlier session, the system had recorded my response before it occurred. Not by seconds alone, by content. One line stated observer initiates silence strategy immediately after personal address. Another, time-stamped before the actual event, stated observer avoids verbal acknowledgement and requests archival correlation. I had made that request 4 minutes later. I sat back from the terminal and listened to the vent tick above me, and the pressure in my ears had followed me out of the observation wing. That had never happened before. It felt as if the site itself had settled around my head and refused to leave. When Iris came in, she startled me enough that I nearly closed the file. She had changed out of her sight jacket. Without it, she looked younger and more tired. There was a red line at the bridge of her nose from too many hours in a respirator mask or safety glasses. She held a mug of vending machine soup that smelled aggressively of salt. "I know I should have left this alone," she said, "but my terminal access got cut and then restored with observer-adjacent restrictions." "That's not a punishment code. That's a reassignment." I looked at her over the monitor glow. "By who?" "System automation. Ellery signed nothing." That matched what I'd begun to suspect. The human oversight existed here, but only within channels the site considered normal. Anything involving the chamber moved faster than people did. I turned the terminal so she could see the mismatched logs. She read in silence, lips moving faintly over key phrases. When she reached the parts the system had rewritten, she let out a soft breath through her nose. "So it lies," she said. "It curates. That's a lie with better branding." Despite myself, I almost smiled. She set the soup down untouched and leaned closer. Her citrus soap had faded. Now she smelled like dry paper and the sharp canned broth in the mug. "Can I tell you what I heard?" she asked. I should have said no. Instead, I nodded. It didn't sound like Elise Harrow to me. I kept my face neutral with effort. What did it sound like? Like someone trying very hard not to scare me. Like... She searched for the right shape. Like a person in the room next door who's figured out the walls are thinner for me than they are for you. I stared at her. "It didn't ask me to let it out," she went on. "It asked why you always stand like you're waiting for bad news you've already approved." That sentence took the air out of the room. Iris must have seen something change in my face because she lowered her voice. "Dr. Mercer, I read enough of the Harrow archive to know she died on your authorization. I didn't go looking for it. The cross-reference was attached to your review profile." I said nothing. I also read the audio summary they keep clipped from Central Transfer. It says you maintained procedure under extreme pressure. It doesn't say you were wrong, and that's not what I mean. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. I mean, the thing in the chamber isn't talking like it wants revenge. It's talking like it wants you to notice something. The vent above us clicked again. Somewhere in the archive stacks, a server fan spun up with a dry whine and settled. "I've spent my career noticing things," I said more sharply than intended. "Specific kinds of things," she replied. The answer irritated me because it was correct. So I did what competent people do when they feel a moral argument forming in a room. I returned to process. "The rules were built after incidents," I said. "They're there because someone learned what happens without them. Or because someone learned what happens when people stop following the script." The word script should have sounded naive in a Foundation archive. Instead, it sounded exact. I looked back at the line in the official log where my unspoken response had already been entered. Observer remains silent. Compliant behavior. Anticipated before action. Approved before intention. Helplessness doesn't always feel like panic. Sometimes it feels like discovering your decisions have been entered into the minutes before the meeting begins. That was the moment the site stopped feeling like a place I supervised and started feeling like a place that had been built to supervise me. I asked Iris a question then, one I'd delayed because I knew I might not like the answer. When it spoke to you, did it use your name? She shook her head. No. Anything personal? No. It kept talking about you. That should have reassured me. Instead, it confirmed the worst possibility available at that stage. And the intimacy was selective. Not because I mattered uniquely, but because the chamber, or the entity, or the system around it had identified the exact pressure point around which my version of reality had been organized for years. Not Elise's death alone. My belief that choosing the system over a person had made me trustworthy. Iris read the rest of the logs while I sat with that. When she finished, she said, "They're treating my responses as contamination." Yes. But if the chamber were actually trying to spread, wouldn't talking be the vector? Why flag me and not you? I looked at the file, at the careful approved language, at my own name rendered twice in concurrent roles, at the omissions around any statement that complicated the site's preferred interpretation. Then I said, "Here, because you understood it differently." The silence after that was small and terrible. On her way out of the archive room, her badge chirped red at the door before unlocking on secondary authorization. She glanced back at me. "They've reclassified me, haven't they?" I didn't lie to her. "Yes." Her hand stayed on the frame. "As what?" I thought of the system message from earlier. Non-compliant anomaly. I couldn't make myself say it. "At risk," I said. She gave a short nod that told me she knew the answer was incomplete and accepted it anyway. When the door shut behind her, the room felt abruptly colder. That was the moment I understood I was watching the site begin to isolate someone younger than me for failing to behave in the approved way around an emergency. I had seen that process before. I had authored part of its language. By morning, Vaughn Ellery was waiting in the observation corridor with 2 security officers and a sealed case in his hands. The corridor air felt thinner than usual, scrubbed so aggressively it smelled almost raw. The metallic tang sat under it like a hidden taste. The hum from the field generators throbbed through the walls and into my sternum. My ears had not equalized all night. Every swallow felt delayed. Ellery set the case on the console between us and flipped the latches with the same quiet efficiency he used for everything else. Inside was a physical switch assembly, old-style, hardwired, something that bypassed the local system interface entirely. Manual lockdown authority, no logging delay, no predictive layer, no interpretation. "We're done observing," he said, "and we're closing the loop." I looked at the case, then at him. "On what basis?" "On pattern convergence," he said. "You've seen enough." "Enough of what?" His eyes held mine for a second, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something close to urgency under the fatigue. "Enough to know the rules work." Behind him, one of the security officers shifted his stance. Iris stood between them, wrists unbound but held in place by proximity alone. Her badge had been removed. She looked pale but not panicked. Her eyes found mine immediately. "They say I compromised the observation environment," she said, voice steady. "Non-compliant anomaly designation pending." The phrase landed exactly where it was meant to. I had written variations of it before. Ellery didn't look at her. She engaged verbally. The system flagged her, and that's the mechanism functioning correctly. "Or the mechanism selecting for a specific outcome," I said. "Same thing," he replied. "No," I said quietly. Not if the outcome is predetermined. The hum in the walls deepened, just slightly. The pressure in my ears tightened again, like the building itself was listening more closely now. Ellery pushed the case toward me. You initiate final lockdown, full isolation. We remove the variable. He meant Iris. He didn't say it. He didn't need to. I looked at her. She didn't plead. That was the worst part. She just watched me the way people watch a decision they already understand. Dr. Mercer, she said carefully, if the rules are filters, what happens to anything that doesn't pass through them? Ellery cut in, sharper now. We don't entertain that line of thought. Why? She asked. Because it leads to system destabilization. No, she said. It leads to accountability. The speaker inside the chamber clicked. All three of us froze. The voice that came through was mine, not from the monitor this time, from the chamber itself. He's about to make the same decision. Ellery moved immediately, reaching for the audio cutoff. I stopped him. Wait. That single word felt heavier than anything I'd said in years. He hesitated. Just enough. The voice continued. You built your identity on consistency, it said, on never deviating from protocol once it proved effective. You called that discipline. Iris didn't look at the chamber. She looked at me. Ellery said, Do not engage. I'm not, I said. That was still true, but I was listening differently now. You told yourself the system exists to remove uncertainty, the voice said. But what it actually removes is responsibility. If the rule decides, you don't have to. The hum in the walls dropped a fraction. Not quieter, looser. Ellery's jaw tightened. This is exactly the contamination vector we warned about. No, I said. This is the first thing that's been consistent. He turned on me. Consistent with what? With what it hasn't done. That stopped him. I kept going. It hasn't asked to leave. It hasn't threatened. It hasn't escalated physically. Every response has been shaped around observer behavior. I gestured toward the chamber. It's not trying to get out. I looked at the case. It's trying to see what we do. The voice spoke again, softer now. What you did. That landed clean, precise, unavoidable. Iris said, I almost under her breath. Then this isn't containment. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. It's replication. Ellery stepped back half a pace. Of what? I met his eyes. Decision environments, I said. Critical moments. Ethical pressure points. It recreates them, then filters responses through rules designed to produce a specific outcome. And that outcome is, he demanded, compliance. The word hung there, heavy, obvious, wrong. Iris said, then the rule isn't don't speak. The rule is don't think differently. Ellery snapped, that's enough. He reached for the manual switch. I moved first, not fast, not dramatic, just certain. I closed the case. The click of the latches sounded louder than it should have. Ellery stared at me. What are you doing? Breaking the rule, I said. The words felt strange, not dangerous. It just unused. The room didn't explode. The system didn't alarm. The chamber didn't change. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was the clearest sign I'd seen yet. Because if the rules were truly about safety, violating them should have consequences, immediate ones. Instead, the hum in the walls dropped another fraction. The pressure in my ears eased. The air felt normal. For the first time since I'd arrived. Ellery noticed it too. I saw it in the way his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. The speaker clicked again. This time it wasn't my voice. It wasn't Elise. It wasn't anything familiar. It was simply present. You see it now. I nodded. Yes. That was the first time I responded. Ellery inhaled sharply. I know. I said. But nothing happened. No breach, no escalation, no containment failure, just silence. Real silence this time. The kind I'd noticed missing on my first day. Iris let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for hours. That's it? No, I said, it's not done. Because I understood something else now. The system hadn't just been filtering responses, it had been reinforcing one. Over and over, across personnel, across incidents, across years. Containment, containment, containment. Until it stopped being a choice and became identity. I looked at Ellery. How many times has this happened? He didn't answer. That was answer enough. The voice spoke one last time. Only one rule matters. We all listened. The hum was almost gone now. The air felt still, unforced. Do not let the system decide what you are willing to do. Silence followed. Long, complete. Then the monitors went dark. Not power loss. Unshutdown. Clean. Final. The chamber beyond the glass was empty. Not visually, actually. The pressure in my ears vanished. The metallic tang in the air faded. The building felt like concrete again instead of something holding its breath. Ellery moved first, rushing to the panel, checking systems, overrides, logs. "Where is it?" he demanded. No answer came, because there was nothing left to answer. Iris looked at me. Did we just release it? I shook my head. No. I glanced at the inactive monitors, at the silent speaker, at the chamber that no longer felt like a center of anything. It was never in there. Ellery stopped moving. Slowly he turned. Then where? I met his eyes, and for the first time since I'd arrived, he looked uncertain. Here, I said. Not the room, not the site, the system, the rules, and the structure we had built to make decisions for us and called that safety. They shut Site 41 down 2 weeks later. Officially, it was listed as a containment reassessment and structural review. No anomaly confirmed, no breach recorded, no personnel loss. Iris Caldwell was reassigned, not disciplined, not exactly. Moved, away from observation work, away from me. Ellery signed the report. It reads clean, controlled, predictable. Exactly the way reports are supposed to read. There is no mention of the voice, no mention of the duplicate subject logs. No mention of the final rule, just a note in the closing summary. Existing containment protocols deemed sufficient. No further deviation required. I kept my own copy. Unedited, unapproved, uncontained. There's one detail I haven't included yet. The system logs, on the ones they couldn't fully rewrite. I accessed them before I left. Deep archive, raw feed, no translation layer. There were hundreds of entries, different observers, different years, different voices, but always the same final pattern, a rule, a test, a decision. And then, a line that appeared before the outcome every time. Observer complies, except once, at the very end, my session, the last entry in the file. It doesn't say compliant, it doesn't say non-compliant, it says something I haven't seen anywhere else in my career. Observer undefined. I don't know if that means I passed. I don't know if it means I failed. All I know is this. For the first time in my life, there wasn't a rule telling me which one it was.